Good morning. Welcome to battle. I have provided some bibliographical information. That comes directly from Dr. Battle's website, and I would encourage you after this time, if you haven't already, to take some time to check out that website and all the resources that are available. The Very Reverend Michael Battle comes to us with degrees from Duke University, Princeton Theological Seminary, and Yale University. He has both academic and church experience, serving in multiple places as a rector in a number of churches, and also on the staff in a number of different academic institutions as well. So we are grateful for his presence here with us. He has some deep ties to Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And in Dr. Battle's Peace Battle Institute, he works on subjects of diversity, spirituality, prayer, race, and reconciliation, all of which are important and deep topics for us. We are excited to welcome Dr. Battle here today, and will you join me in welcoming him?
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you for welcoming me to your community. Are we okay? Are you able to hear me all right?
Hold on one second. All right, go ahead.
So I want to engage you, and I think for 15 or 20 minutes, just to give you some things to think about and reflect upon. And then I understand we have the opportunity to have some discussion. So it's an honor to be with you. And I want to talk about something that in our 21st century Western world usually doesn't go together very well, even though as Christians we understand it theologically, at least I hope we understand it theologically, that we worship a God who became a convict. And through Christ, it's difficult to understand that as a paradox, because usually we see it as a contradiction. So Jesus was a conflict. And for those of us practicing Christian spirituality, this means it is vitally important to have a deeper understanding of what justice is. In other words, justice is not only a discourse for lawyers, judges, police. In fact, much of Jesus' discussion in the Bible is surrounded by those who are seeking justice, and much of Jesus' response in the Bible is centered upon a different kind of justice. So in our 21st century world, it's difficult to put Christian spirituality and justice together, but that's what I want us to reflect upon now. If we understand Jesus' approach to justice, then we will have a better purchase on what restorative justice is, as opposed to retributive justice, that is our default mode. Restorative justice is a profound display of what Jesus does on the cross. And we will have a better purchase on what restorative justice is and how to implement it in ordinary time and ordinary life. Pay attention to what occurs on the cross when Jesus dies like a criminal. We are then more apt to understand Jesus' justice as akin to Christian spirituality. So on Good Friday, one of the most well-known Protestant theologians in the world, Karl Barth, spoke at a church service conducted within the walls of a prison in Basel, Switzerland, and this occurred in 1957. And this is what he said. Here they hang, all three, Jesus and the criminals, one at the right and one at the left, all three exposed to the same public abuse, to the same interminable pain, to the same slow and irrevocable death throes. And Bart goes on to say, these two companions were evidently and undeniably criminals, evil people, godless people, unjust people, and Christ, like them, was condemned, sacrificed as a lawbreaker, a criminal. All three were under the same verdict. This was the first Christian fellowship, Bart says, the first certain, indissoluble, and indestructible Christian community. Christian community is manifest, he goes on to say, wherever there is a group of people close to Jesus who are with him in such a way that they are directly and unambiguously affected by his promise. And then he concludes, consider this fact. Jesus died precisely for these two criminals who were crucified on his right and on his left and went to their death with him. He did not die for the pious, but for the godless, not for the just, but for the unjust. We are such people, all of us. You in this house, Bart says to those prisoners, you in this house, which is called a prison, and those of us outside who have different experiences yet are, believe me, in the same predicament. In reality, we all are these people, these crucified criminals. And only one thing matters now. Are we ready to be told what we are? Are we ready to hear the promise given to the condemned? This was Bart's sermon in 1957 to Swiss prisoners, and I think it can be preached just as well in our 21st century. To us who are free, not in prison, but if we look more closely through the struggles we have in our lives, we still remain incarcerated. The problem with Jesus' cross is that it is easy to fall into what seems to be a bottomless pit of despair. We may have a lot going for us, but inevitably the scale of fraction in the world, the scale of being broken in the world is so enormous that we may not feel as though there is really any symmetry between Christian spirituality and justice. For example, many of you may have heard of Bryan Stevenson, a lawyer that has really taken up the vocation of articulating restorative justice in the penal systems and in our prisons. Bryan Stevenson invites us into what that despair looks like in our 21st century. He recently said, based on the statistics of those who are currently in prison, he said that 1 in 3 Black males born in the year 2017, 1 in 3 Black males born in the year 2017 will go to prison. That is easy for us to hear in a way in which despair debilitates us. But our task today is not to be paralyzed by despair. Our task is to work to make symmetrical Christian spirituality and justice. Our task as Christians is not to give into despair, but follow the practicality of how justice and Christian spirituality relate to each other. I said the practicality of how justice and Christian spirituality relate. And this is a bold claim because much of what I've been saying today is that there is despair, that there is the temptation of falling into a bottomless pit of despair when it comes to understanding justice and how it relates to Christian spirituality. But bringing them together creates a practical response, creates a practical way of understanding why Christians matter today. There is a practical side of Christian spirituality that draws us away from destructive tendencies and towards solutions best suited not just for individuals, but for the entire planet of Earth, for the realm of heaven, for those communities who have died, those communities who are living, and for those communities who have not been born. There's something among us as Christians in which we have a perspective unlike most. We understand that justice and Christian spirituality have to relate because of how God created us. In other words, God created us to be immortal, eternal. God has given us this way of seeing heaven, not as an individualistic pursuit, but as a communal one, an interdependent pursuit. Heaven's immortality is extremely practical. And I think that's one of the reasons why Jesus turns to one of the criminals and says, "Today you will be with me in heaven, in paradise." Jesus teaches us that unless we practice realities in the midst of despair, beyond our normal conflicts, there can be no future. For example, one of the greatest ways of seeing how Christian spirituality is practical, even for nation states, is looking at South Africa. South Africa practiced something extraordinary but was practical, something most nation states have not done. Many other nation states have practiced a truth commission, but South Africa practiced a truth and reconciliation commission. The idealism of moving beyond conflict was practiced in very practical ways so that South Africa could maintain any semblance of a nation state. Instead of falling into the despair of a Middle Eastern quagmire of violence, South Africa practiced a context not of retributive justice, but one of restorative justice. And South Africa has to be noticed by us in the Western world because it can't be by accident that major exemplars of moral and spiritual formation came from there. For example, Mahatma Gandhi, he articulated his philosophy of nonviolence called Satyagraha in South Africa. We have also Albert Lutuli, that many of you may not even know of, but won one of the first Nobel Peace Prizes. Nelson Mandela, whose life is so epic, it could easily fit into the Bible. Someone who was in prison for 27 years, and the first time he gets to vote, he becomes the president. And someone who mentored me, I lived with him for 2 years, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Bringing together spirituality, Christian spirituality, and justice is a practical response in the world that we live in. And therefore, given the vision of Jesus' spirituality, we aim at bringing our deep desires into conformity with the demands of Christian spirituality that is symmetrical, in sync, with God's justice. If we think about Jesus' paradise that he says to his fellow criminal on the cross, it's a paradise contingent with earth, a paradise that is not disembodied. It's a paradise that relates to ordinariness and even deeper relates to brokenness and suffering and shame. Jesus brings together a Christian spirituality of justice so that we can understand how we are related no matter how much we resist. We are related to God. No matter how much we do not believe, we are related to God. No matter how unjust we can be, we relate to God. Jesus gives us a paradise, which is a place contingent with earth that allows only those goods that perfect human nature can provide through his image. In other words, Jesus is the only one who really shows us what it means to be fully human. And as we believe as Christians, shows us how to bring together someone who is fully human with being fully God. So in Jesus, we find how Christian spirituality and justice come together. And we also find that incarnation being practical, being profound, being a way in which we are invited to leave our excuses, to leave our binaries of being those who want retributive justice and those who want restorative justice. Christ the convict is an apparent contradiction, but in such a contradiction, the paradox is how Jesus is leading us to resolve conflicts that seem eternal, conflicts that seem that they cannot go away. But as Jesus says to the disciples, so he says to us, with mortals, it is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. So we should be of good courage, and we should see how there is a uniqueness to our Christian spirituality, in which we are not running away from a suffering world. We're not running away from that which most are running away from. But stealing an advertisement from the military, we run towards brokenness. We run towards suffering. Because in so doing, we run toward an image of God hanging on a cross. And even though Jesus dies, goes through annihilation, the greatest contradiction is that God cannot stay dead. And the resurrection is our sign that we can indeed live in the symmetry of Christian spirituality and justice. So I'll end there so that we can have some conversation and hopefully some ways in which to talk about our issues of the day.
Okay, I'm going to invite you all, as you have questions, if you would feed those to me, and I'll feed those to Dr. Those of you who are online, if you'd like to type those questions, you're welcome to do that, and we'll address those as well. Mm-hmm. The first question is, what practices
Melissa, can you repeat that question for me again, please?
Sure. The question is, what practices do you associate with Christian spirituality?
Yeah, good question. I think as I've learned from St. Anthony, who helped us to really start the monastic movement, the key practices for Christian spirituality for those in the desert tradition were to pray, but prayer that is not simply with words, but prayer with our bodies, prayer with our finances, prayer with our families, our relationships. And I think the way that it was summed up in that first century world was through one of the desert sayings, that what sums up Christian spirituality is in this desert saying. And the desert saying is this: a disciple went to one of the monks, and the disciple was trying to learn how to practice Christian spirituality. And one of the key practices was to ask the right question. And so the disciple came to the monk and asked, "How shall I not pray?" And the monk said, "You've asked the right question, and you should not pray for revenge, and you should not pray for yourself." And the disciple was taken aback because he couldn't understand how you could not pray for yourself. And he said that in so many words to the monk. And the monk responded, "If God bears our burdens and puts up with us, we disrespect God when we pray for ourselves, who knows our needs before we ask." And then the disciple said, "Well, can I ask a question that may appear to be the wrong question? How should I pray?" And the monk said, "Now you have gotten to the correct question by having to go through a deep way of understanding spirituality. You should learn to understand that when you practice patience, when you practice forgiveness, when you practice understanding your love for God as love for neighbor, when you do such practices, you become prayer." So that's one of the desert sayings that I think helps us to understand the key practice, and that is through prayer, but not only through words.
Did you have a comment? Okay. So the question is, would the removal of Confederate statues be an example of restorative justice?
I think we are experiencing differences of suffering, and I will answer the question, but I have to answer it inductively. All of our struggles around Confederate flags, to me, represent a kind of suffering that has not gone away. One of my favorite Christian mystics is named Simone Weil. Have any of you ever heard of Simone Weil? If you have, can you raise your hand so I can see if you've ever heard of her? Wonderful. Simone Weil is a French Christian mystic who lived in the 30s and the 40s. And she wrote that there are two kinds of suffering. There's a suffering like a broken arm or getting a cold virus that can be relieved or can be set back in joint. That's the suffering that most of us understand suffering to be. Well, she said there's a second kind of suffering. It's a suffering called affliction. Affliction is something that never goes away. Something like rape, something like slavery. And she says the problem with us is that oftentimes we approach affliction as if we have the ability to relieve it or to set it back in joint. But affliction is something only God can heal. And she says this in a way that I think gives us some wisdom about what's happening in the United States around Confederate flags. there has been an affliction of slavery. And no matter what we say or do, that's staying with us. It's one of the beginning context of how this United States became a nation. It's one of the major ways that we understand our identity as Americans is because of how the understanding of slavery articulated who we are. We even created a civil war and divided our understanding of being a church and denominations based on the line drawn in the sand around slavery. So Confederate flags, removing them may be a good gesture for some, but unless we get at the root of the disease, we will just continue addressing symptoms as opposed to what South Africa did in terms of having a formal public way of addressing the disease that was occurring in that nation state. The United States has never had a come to Jesus public way of understanding what our affliction is. And because of that, we just continue to repeat cycles of violence, cycles of just trying not to understand what's occurring. And as Brian Stevenson said about prison systems, we continue to live in ways in which our world shows that, especially the United States, is dysfunctional. Now, having said all of that, those of us who are citizens in the United States know that this is the destination of most people in the world. Most people want to live with us. But we cannot have the hubris to think that we have arrived in terms of being the most moral nation on the planet. We are not. And the symptoms that we see that show us our fragility and our brokenness are things like still fighting over Confederate flags.
Other questions?
Dr. Bradford, he had the church 2 years in life.
Dr. Battle, this question comes from one of your former students, so be proud. She asked what the church will look like in 50 years and what practices can we bring about now that will help the church become what it can be. Did I capture that?
Okay, Melissa, let me make sure I heard that correctly. What will the church look like in 50 years? And what was the second part?
What practices can we nurture now to help the church become what it can be?
50 years. So what year will that be? That will be the year 2067. I'm a big Star Trek fan. Any Star Trekkers, any Trekkers out there? Especially those of you, watch this new one called Star Trek Discovery. They're doing some pretty creative things in that new series. The problem is you have to get a subscription and pay more money. I think the first part of what we will look like in 50 years, I think we're going to have to look a lot more ecumenical. And I would encourage you to look at Stanley Hauerwas's essay in the Washington Post in this year in which you celebrate 500 years of the Reformation. And Hauerwas makes an argument that the church is going to have to look more Catholic with the small c, not the RC, but the small c, and Catholic meaning global, meaning universal, that we're going to have to look more like that. Otherwise, we become even more part of the problem of the conflicts in our society. So his argument is that the church of the future is going to have to get its act together Otherwise, those institutions that are practicing diversity better than the church today, like universities, even the military is able to be diverse better than the church, unless we can become an ecumenical body that mimics the image of God, that is being three persons in one nature, then we will actually be following secular society. And I think if you think about it, the problem for us as churches is we gather and worship based on affinity groups, and a Martian looking at us sees us as groups of people who are naturally want to be together, like a high school cafeteria. You see all the jocks sitting together, and you see all the preppy people sitting together, and I don't even know the new contemporary names, things like the goths and whatever. I have teenagers, so I should be knowing these names. But the problem is our churches, a Martian looking at us sees the same dynamics. We gather based on affinity groups, based on people that we want to be with. And it's not by accident, and in some ways we have some excuses. We want to be with people that we naturally like. If you think about eating together, you want to be with people that you naturally can have a conversation with, otherwise you get indigestion, always thinking about what you're going to say before you say it. We naturally want to be with our culture, with our race, with our socioeconomic groups. But the problem with that is that God is calling us not to be natural. God is calling us to be supernatural. And God is asking us, because God could force us, God is asking us to learn how to practice the response of being supernatural, and asking us to do a particular form of that, to know that our baptism is our primary identity. As Christians, our baptism is our primary identity. So our primary identity is not being a jock or a prep or being Republican or Democrat or conservative or liberal or male or female or gay or straight. Our primary identity is in our baptism. That is, our identity is in Christ. That's our primary identity. Other identities are not bad identities. It's just that God is giving us a way to order them so they don't collide, so that they can be in concert. So the Church of the Future has to be more diverse and mimic the way in which diversity doesn't collide with unity. And I think practices are, I wrote a book with Tony Campolo called The Church Enslaved, a Spirituality of Racial Reconciliation. And one of the practices we agreed upon in that book is that churches need to be more intentional in terms of resources. So Tony Campolo, he said in our book together, he said, a rich white church in an urban environment, the pastor should get up on Sunday morning and say to the superintendent of the public schools, who most likely attends that church, Sarah, I want you to go and worship at the church down the street. That's a storefront church, and I want you to pledge at that church for 1 year, and I want you to build up the Sunday school. God has given you experiences, God has given you resources, and I want you for 1 year to go and build up the youth program. Pledge your resources as you would normally do to our congregation, but I want you to build up that storefront church. Now, can you imagine that happening in your church? And I think those are the kinds of practices that are pretty radical, but will show us what I'm trying to say about Catholicity, that we see our identity in each other, no matter what denomination we are, no matter what race we are or socioeconomic background. We understand ourselves as a church-based baptism. And those are the kind of practices, radical practices, for us to be a part of the solution for the future.
Melissa, I told you was trying to get us a question out of the comment. The Sunday massacre in Texas. And we've been watching that unfold in social media. And this asymmetry that I was talking about, I think is very evident in the last 48 hours. There's a group of folks that are just saying we need to stay and do better. And there's another group of folks saying we've got to do something about this.
Can you pause there and I'll get that much to it? Okay, so here's the first half of it, and then we'll get to it. The events from this past weekend in Texas, and the kind of social media battle that rages on now over what's the response to that. So there's kind of a like the gun battle, and phrase it another thing. The spirituality of evil. The spirituality of evil. Hang on, I'll get the rest of it.
And that's about it.
Oh.
What is the symmetrical response to such a tragedy?
So the question is, so what's the symmetrical response to such a tragedy as we've experienced?
Yeah, I heard this morning a very interesting occurrence that's currently going on in the community. It's the civic society that is actually ministering to the church, and I thought that was profound. So it's in the mayor's office that they've set up lunches for some of the family members who experienced their deaths. The school systems have figured out how to care holistically for those who have experienced the tragedies. So it's the secular world that becomes the pastor to the church. And so I think that's one lens through which to see the symmetry, that the church can actually be ministered to by God's people, no matter if they call themselves Christians or if they are liberal or conservative. In what we call a secular world, as you can probably hear the siren going off here in New York City, those responses from the secular world, that's probably a ambulance going to help save someone. God is in that which appears to be secular. So there's symmetry. There's symmetry between the church and the secular world. I think also our responses around gun control that have been divided and bifurcated between so-called conservative people and so-called liberal people. We need to figure out symmetry with that, because we've seen more and more as evidence has come out that there were systemic problems going on with that family, and that in the military there were practices that seemed to be more of a cover-up than the integrity of showing the dysfunction of the family. And I think as Christians, when we practice a liturgy in which we're trying to help people clean with what's occurring in their lives, to confess their sins, to be authentic and knowing that you can't hide anything from God, that can be a preventive measure. And it's a practical measure to help us not be in such tragedies, so that people can help further up the stream to stop the tragedy from occurring. And I also think a symmetrical response to this tragedy is for all churches to have some way of practicing a way of understanding a response, not just because it's a church, but because of the way in which something occurred that was blasphemous, that someone went into a sacred space and killed people. And that cannot help but get into the DNA of all churches in which a sacred space has been profaned. So I think one of the responses for us as churches is that all of us, Roman Catholic, Pentecostal, Orthodox, we should try to figure out how to do something in common, because this is not a unique event where you've had something so blasphemous and profane of killing people. Remember how Dylan Storm Roof went in and killed the pastor and the whole Bible study group. And I know when I was in South Africa, there was a bombing during a worship service on Sunday morning as well. This is not unique, that violence occurs even in sacred spaces. But I think one of the ways in which we can practice being ecumenical is that we should figure out one unified way of one of the Sunday mornings in which we have a principal worship service and pray on behalf of this church community in Texas, and to pray that what was deemed profane can be restored and redeemed.
Following up a little bit from the Texas discussion, anger is a pretty natural response to a lot of what we see. It seems that anger tends to fuel retributive justice. How can we take our anger and do something restorative?
Anger is not a bad thing. Anger shows us that something is wrong. Anger can be a motivation to change either injustice, to change those who are being victimized. Anger in itself is not wrong. Even many of our biblical narratives have attributed anger to God. The problem with anger is that the only one who can truly match anger with the object of what we should be angry against is God. You see, some of our problems is that we get angry because of our hormones, or we get irritated because of what someone said 2 weeks ago, and we're just now processing that, and we are subconsciously acting out of anger. And then we transfer that onto an innocent person. So the problem with our anger is its dislocation. But God's anger is always direct, unmediated. God understands what needs to be changed. So I think when we think about anger, that takes us back to what I was saying about the chief practice of Christian spirituality. And that is, not only does the monk say you should not pray for revenge, but the monk is asking the disciple to become prayer. And I think that's what helps us with our own version of indignation. But only God can truly be indignant. That is, to be angry in a way in which it's fully, directly to the outcome that needs to be changed. And I think when we practice a Christian spirituality, similar to what St. Ignatius is teaching us of examine, of understanding how to examine who we are and why we are and what's going on a daily basis, then the slow creep of sin, the slow creep of addictions, the slow creep of what someone said to us 2 weeks ago, all of that would have been analyzed, examined, so that we do not act out of a false nature or act out on our own anger that usually leads to violence. And that's one of the reasons why Jesus teaches in the Sermon on the Mount to be more conscious of anger before there is ever homicide. So those are some responses that I think Christian spirituality is key to understanding how to appropriate anger. But anger in and of itself is not wrong.
Dr. Bynum, you've talked a lot about, or we've talked some about what the church can do and what we as individuals can do. We sit here in a seminary, and our job is to prepare women and men for ministry. What do you think the academy can do, specifically seminaries, theological institutions, can do in preparing the next generation of ministers to be leaders in restorative justice?
Yeah, I think my model is two of Jesus's best friends, Mary and Martha. As you know, Mary represents contemplation because she just wanted to be with Jesus. And Martha represents activism because she wanted to make sure that the place where Jesus was dignified and hospitable. And the problem is that oftentimes we want to keep those two apart. And then in our Christian churches, we tend to blame the other based on those two dynamics. Liberal churches, who want to be more activists, blame people who just want to go to church and worship God. And those who just want to go to church and worship God blame those liberals, those progressive Christians. I think what we have to try to figure out is that the academy, the default mode is Mary. In the academies that I've taught in, we are those who usually teach and grade based on contemplative practices, reading text, responding to exams, and so on. But I think in the future, and even now, I see some examples of it. The best seminaries they understand that Mary and Martha are sisters. The best seminaries are not just about education in terms of a cognitive, rational response to an exegetical paper, but the best seminaries are those who bring Martha back into the picture. And so service learning projects, I think every class, no matter what it is, no matter what class it is and how theoretical it should have a practical component to it. Even a service learning component. So when I teach my classes in theology, I require my students to go and actually experience it. So if I'm teaching something on poverty, then students have to go and volunteer in a soup kitchen in New York City. Or if I'm teaching the theories of just war, students either have to go and volunteer in a prison, or they have to go and interview a police officer about just war. I think our academies, especially seminaries, because we're in a Western world, we teach in a pretty individualistic way also. And we teach in a pretty competitive way. So some of my students get an A because they feel as though they've arrived, that they feel as though they're not an F kind of student, and it sort of becomes an identity issue, your grades. And I don't think that's the way Jesus was trying to teach us, because Jesus taught in a sort of upside down way. The first will be the last will be the first. Those who are weak or strong, the strongest are weak. I mean, Jesus taught in an upside down way, and I think for those in the academy, we have a lot to learn from the desert tradition, who taught and formed disciples through that wisdom of how Jesus taught. So seminaries need to figure out that relationship of Mary and Martha. And I think I think seminaries also need to be a little more ecumenical. Even though I teach at an Episcopal seminary and you are a Baptist seminary, we need to figure out how to bring those who are different from us in our Christian spirituality to remind us how we are greater than the sum of our parts.
Does anyone online have any questions for us? All right, before we go, if you could outline 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 books that you would put on a reading list, that would be helpful to advance this conversation and help us in our learning as well.
Yeah, I would definitely read The Convict Christ by Jen Soering, Soering, and also read Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. And I would also encourage you to read Desmond Tutu's book, No Future Without Forgiveness. So I would give you that trinity of text in terms of what I was trying to teach and lead a conversation around today.
Anything else from you all? Dr. Battle, thank you for joining us today. We are grateful for your presence here with us, your leadership, and the work that you continue to do in various parts of your career, and we are grateful for that. So thank you. Will you all join me and thank you, Dr. Battle. As we go, I also want to say a word of thank you to the Hampton Baptist Church and Reverend Chester Brown, who we're happy to have with us today. This series is made possible because of a generous contribution from Hampton Baptist Church in honor of Dr. Brown, and we are grateful for their care of the church and of the seminary, and we're grateful for the gifts that they have given to make this series possible. As we go, there is food in the lounge. We hope you will stay and enjoy. Dr. Battle will mail you a sandwich. How's that? Let me bless the food as we go and give thanks for our time together. Let's pray. Eternal God, we are grateful for the ways that you are at work among us in various parts of the country and various parts of the world. God, we pray that you would give us a continued vision of what it looks like to follow the way of Jesus, the way of justice, and only the way that you have designed. So God, as we go from this place, help us to be agents of change, agents of reconciliation, agents of love and grace and mercy. Bless the food that we will share together and bless our time together. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Thank you. Thank you very much. We appreciate your presence.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.